The Civil War changed everything in Kentucky. The Commonwealth, communities, and even families were divided over the core issues of slavery and secession. As a slave state, Kentucky remained with the Union. As a border state, Kentucky became a strategic battleground. This pivotal period is documented in diaries, military records, and newspapers, but some events have been lost in the smoke of war, and some perspectives have never been documented. Archaeologists explore this hallowed landscape, seeking clues about life on both the front lines and the home front. In September of 1862, Confederate forces under Generals Bragg and Smith occupied most of southern Kentucky. An attack on northern cities seemed imminent. Union troops and local militias rushed to bolster defenses around key ports such as Covington, Louisville, and Paducah. These fortifications, combined with overwhelming Union forces, discouraged major Confederate advances. Only a few of these fortifications from the Great Emergency have survived. One is Battery Hooper in northern Kentucky.
We are standing at the site of Battery Hooper. Battery Hooper was one of 28 fortifications built here between 1861 and 1865 by the Union Army during the Civil War. It was a cannon battery, so it was a U-shaped earth fortification built in 1861. Because it was built in 1861, we have found out it was built more according to military specifications than we had expected. It has a wonderful stone foundation to the gun emplacement itself. The powder magazine has a stone foundation, so we're working on trying to uncover all of those foundation pieces today.
Surveys help to verify the materials and dimensions of the fortifications. This data allows archaeologists to compare military plans to the actual evidence in the ground.
I've done about 6 weeks of excavation at another site called Battery Bates. That site was built in 1862 and 1863. It's completely of earth. There's no stonework at all. And what the official records don't tell us is that they used two different construction methods. Those built in 1861 were built to military specifications. They were not in a hurry. At Battery Bates, the other one, there's no stone at all because it was first thrown up or built during the emergency in September of 1862. They were in a hurry. They needed the dirt piled up to hide the cannon behind. So we found some very interesting differences for comparison.
The impact of historical archaeology is also evident at Camp Nelson Civil War Heritage Park. Each summer, reenactors gather here to commemorate the camp's unique role during the Civil War.
Camp Nelson began as a United States Army supply depot in 1863, and then in 1864 it became the state's largest recruitment and training camp for African American troops, who were referred to as U.S. colored troops, and also became the state's largest refugee camp for African American women and children, most of whom were the wives and children of these enlisting soldiers.
Camp Nelson was massive. This sprawling complex of forts, warehouses, and barracks covered over 6 square miles. After the war, most of the buildings were dismantled, but archaeologists have made numerous discoveries throughout the grounds.
I think one aspect of historic archaeology is it probably gives more of a perspective from the common soldier, while documents give more of a perspective from the officers, the elite of the Army.
Artifacts show enlisted men had cheaper buttons and dishes and lower quality foods. The bones of rabbit, squirrel, raccoon, and duck were found at the sites of enlisted men. This suggests soldiers supplemented their Army rations by hunting wild game.
Foodways in particular, what soldiers were eating is an area where archaeology has made a big contribution, and see that there's a lot more variability than we might think from understanding the rations that are documented in numerous records. There was a lot of supplementing the diet through hunting, gathering, collecting, purchasing, robbing, what have you.
McBride has also conducted excavations at the site of a Civil War tragedy, the refugee encampment site.
The archaeology at the encampment site was directed towards first really understanding the spatial layout of the site, and then also the internal organization, perhaps such questions as how many cabins were there, what activities were going on at the cabins. One thing we were really interested in, besides just kind of a general question on day-to-day life, was what occupations did the women have? In order to stay, they needed to have some legitimate, necessary, vital employment, and one of the most common, or the two most common employment jobs for women were washerwomen or laundresses and cooks.
Nearly 10,000 former slaves enlisted at Camp Nelson alone. In 1864, enlistment for men meant emancipation. But the dependents of black soldiers, their wives, children, and relatives, were still considered slaves under state and federal law. With nowhere to go, dependents built shanty towns in and around the military camp. Periodically, Union commanders would drive out those living in the refugee encampments who did not have an official job.
We started picking up a lot of buttons, a lot more buttons we had found at any other site, as well as other clothing items like hooks and eyes, and a lot of seed beads, really tiny beads that would be sewn in clothing or purses. And some of these buttons were like officers' buttons and other military buttons. And what these artifacts suggest is these buttons are probably lost from doing laundry.
Oh, no.
On a cold week in November 1864, Camp Nelson's commander ordered another ejection of all unemployed personnel. Over 400 refugees, the families of Union soldiers, were loaded onto wagons and dumped along the road to Nicholasville.
When they ejected the refugees out of the camp, the soldiers were ordered to destroy the camps and burn the shanties or cabins that the people had built. And we actually have pretty obvious archaeological evidence of this burning in the thick ash zones, burned nails, melted glass, other burned artifacts.
Over the course of the next few days, the temperature dipped below freezing. The refugees had little shelter. About 100 of them died from exposure. Most of the dead were children. This tragedy caused a national uproar. As a direct result, the federal government changed its policy, granting the dependents of black soldiers their freedom. With the aid of missionaries, the Union Army built shelters for refugee families at Camp Nelson. In time, over 3,000 African Americans found sanctuary, medical care, and schooling at the Home for Colored Refugees.
And it's just such a paradox or contradiction considering what the Civil War was about, particularly after the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, which was over a year before the ejection happened here. But it kind of reinforces the sort of paradoxical nature of Kentucky as a Union state but a slave state in the Civil War.
8 regiments of U.S. colored troops were established at Camp Nelson, including the 12th Heavy Artillery.
This is a reproduction bronze cannon from the actual Civil War, the 1861 period.
The 12th was reactivated in 2003. Today, Members provide educational programs to help preserve the memory of those who served and died during the Civil War.
And the archaeological work that has been done here helps us to better understand how the refugees lived. It also helps us to better understand the soldiers and some of the things that they did. And without that, certainly you have the military record, but the military record itself does not tell the complete story. You need the archaeological aspect to get a complete story of all the people that were here.
Archaeology has been instrumental in efforts to preserve dozens of Civil War sites in Kentucky. Each one speaks to a pivotal chapter in the state's history.
Historical archaeology has made numerous contributions in the understanding of the Civil War, particularly by adding the perspective of material culture to the documents, which is a normal way to investigate it. And particularly if you look at it through three different kind of site types, encampments, here archaeology helps better understand the everyday life of common soldiers, what they ate, what kind of supplies they had, what kind of ammunition they had, what their housing looked like. On fortifications, we can look at what kind of variability there was in the construction of fortifications. Did they follow the engineer's plan, or did they make alterations on those? The third main type of site are battlefields, and this is perhaps almost a whole subdiscipline itself and has different methods. And here we've made contributions in understanding the troop positions and movements, their ammunition, and particularly how that might fit in with the documents, which again are provided mostly by officers who have an agenda to describe the battle, but also perhaps to make themselves not look too bad. The archaeology can provide perhaps a more objective view of what happened during a battle.